Hello everyone, Ruby Ravel here, ready for another edition of The Stars Unraveled. And the tricksy stellar aspect we will be unraveling today is Mercury Retrograde, a phrase that can instill fear even in the hearts of those who usually scoff at anything as tawdry and ridiculous as astrology. Tawdry and ridiculous for you right here. And I think one of the reasons for this is that while all of the planets are capable of retrograde motion, barring the sun and the moon, except in the case of some kind of mad cosmic disaster, Mercury goes retrograde at least 3 times a year, which means that the interruptions, the delays, the difficulties, the frustrations and sudden upheavals that we associate with that transit happen regularly enough that it is hard to ignore them and not see the telltale signs and symptoms of them when they are underway. So when a planet goes retrograde, it appears to be defying the inexorable onward march of time and to actually be moving backwards in motion against the background of the zodiac, to be heading into the past, to be making a descent into and a return to what has already been traversed. Needless to say, the planet in question is not actually going backwards just due to the parallax of the Earth's orbit and that of Mercury, which kind of intersect in this weird mathematical way, which I won't bother to explain because I don't fully understand it. It creates this visual illusion from our geocentric perspective whereby, it looks like it's going backwards in time. And that says something about the meaning of retrogrades. You know, we are so often concerned with onward motion, with progress, with always making that march into the future towards our goals, towards our desires, towards our dreams, towards what we want, that we are quite shocked when suddenly things stop and actually seem to be going backwards. And the response to that most of the time is one of frustration and anger, because very often in the build up to a retrograde, we can actually go through a period where Mercury feels very much on our side, where things just seem to be racing along at a great pace. We seem to be making progress. Everything's falling into place with in our minds. You know, we're communicating really well. We're having lots of interactions, lots of interesting little possibilities and patterns and details are all coming our way. And then suddenly, bam, something happens and everything starts to deliquesce, to incohere, to no longer coalesce in a neat way, but to start falling apart. And this is because we rely upon Mercury as a planet and as a deity to give us synthesis. You know, Mercury was the mediator, the messenger of the gods, as well as being a sorcerer. His job as a mediator and functioning within us as our minds is to act as this mediator between the inner and the outer world. And this is a function that we rely upon all the time. We look out into the world, to our environment, to the people around us, and we analyze them. We pick up details, we pick information, we eat them up, we gobble them up with our mind, and we try and translate something that makes sense to us and imposes meaning on the world within us. But likewise, we already do that when we communicate with other people. You know, our mind is always analyzing our emotions, our feelings, our bodies, and for all of this sensory data and emotional and spiritual data that's going on within us. And if any of that is significant enough that we feel the need to translate it, we rely upon Mercury to take things that are wordless by nature and to translate them into the words so that we can communicate them back out there. So he plays this function of being the translator between the inner and the outer. And people who have a very good Mercury are people who are very skilled at doing that. You know, they can observe an external situation and very quickly find all the patterns and details and connect them together into this kind of coherent whole that makes sense of a situation very quickly and then can explain that situation verbally. Or they can be these emotionally intelligent people who are very aware of what's going inside them and can process things very quickly so they can express that back to other people, which is why we associate Mercurial people as being intelligent, witty, glib, charming, these people who never seem at a loss for words and can put things together all very neatly. And that ability to synthesize those dualities and to make them into this coherent whole is why Mercury is depicted holding the wand of the caduceus with these two serpents interwoven in this double helix strand. That is representing taking those separate dualities and weaving them into this non-dual thing, into this thing that is whole and perfect and coherent and which makes sense. And when our Mercuries are functioning well, we have that sense of coherence, we have that sense of sense, we have that ability of being able to translate the inner and the outer and vice versa. Whereas during Mercury retrograde, that actually becomes more problematic. For some reason, when we're trying to translate what's going on in our inner worlds, we misread something, we misexpress something, and therefore it comes across in the other way. Or someone does the same to us, but our processing mechanism isn't working, and so we don't receive it in the right way, which is why miscommunication ends up being one of the big bugbears of Mercury retrograde. It's because people aren't processing or communicating things as well as they normally would. And when you're getting false data, it's very easy to have a false response. And I've had this happen to me loads of times during Mercury retrograde. I have some kind of argument or fallout with someone, and they don't understand what I'm saying. I don't understand what I'm saying. I don't understand what they're saying. And once everyone's calmed down and we kind of collect and regroup afterwards, we realize so much of what we've gotten upset about the other person saying was all based on misunderstanding anyway, that they weren't saying what we thought they were saying, and we weren't saying what we think we were saying. And so those crossed and blurred lines of translation very often occur during Mercury retrograde, which is why generally, rather than storming into things and letting your tongue run away with you as I'm doing now, Mercury retrograde is a good time to think things through, to be very sure about the decisions and the choices that you're making. In fact, in general, Mercury retrograde is a time for introspecting, for thinking about your decisions, for thinking about what you want, for really contemplating things in great detail, in depth, and not rushing into anything. Because most of the time, if we try and rush a decision or come to a conclusion about something during Mercury retrograde, as soon as it goes direct again, some problem will arise, or we may even have a sudden change of mind, and the whole thing has kind of been wasted. So it's a time for introspection, for reviewing the past, rather than making that decisive leap into the future. Now, because of this retrograde motion, Mercury can get locked into the same aspects for a long period of time, and one of those is Mercury being conjunct Pluto. And I talked in my last videos about Venus conjunct Pluto and Pluto ruling the underworld. And Mercury also has a connection to the underworld. Mercury, Hermes in legend, he was the only one of the gods who could move freely between all the different worlds. He could go to heaven in Mount Olympus. He could walk among mortals in any number of crafty disguises. And he could also wander down to Hades and sail along the river Styx as though it was nothing. Not even Zeus could do that. Mercury could move freely between all those realms, and one of his roles was actually as Phonian Mercury, as a hieropomp, whose job it was to guide deceased souls down to the land of the dead and presumably back again when they were ready to be reborn. And this says something about the capacity of the mind in its ability to traverse many things. With our mind, we can comprehend the infinities of the universe, all these complex mathematical sums. We can think about quantum physics. We can think about all of these enormous structures that try and make sense of things that are so much bigger and more complicated than we are, and yet which are reflected holographically within ourselves. We can also have those very banal day-to-day thoughts where we're thinking about food, where we're thinking about money, where we're thinking about the sex we'd like to be having, all those just general the general chatter of I want this, I want that, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that, that's going on in our minds. But we've also got the deeper layers, the animal layers, the layer where we fear, the layer where our traumas and our memories and where our taboo desires are all kept. And very often when Mercury is conjunct Pluto, we become more aware of that deeper, darker layer of our mind. We become aware of our capacity to be hateful, to be resentful, to be malicious, to be jealous, to want things that we feel like we really shouldn't want, to have these deep animal cravings. And that part of us which thinks about survival and the accumulation of power above all else. And, whereas we might like to think most of our interactions with people are based on noble things or on Venusian love and charm, with Pluto, it's all about how can I fuck over the other guy so he doesn't fuck me over first? How can I use this person to my advantage to achieve my aims? There's always this longer, secret, ulterior motive going on with Mercury Pluto. And as such, Mercury Pluto is often, especially being in Capricorn, is often more inclined to be very secretive, to be very guarded. It knows it has these motives, it knows it has these hidden darker depths to itself, and it doesn't want other people to know about them. Because if they did, that would give them an avenue of control, which Mercury Pluto does not want to yield to them. But likewise, it's always keenly trying to analyze and observe other people and to look below people's depths and to have those psychic intuitions about what is really going on with someone, about what they really want, because then it can control and influence and manipulate that person in clever ways, which can be to its own advantage. So there's all this power and people politics going on with Mercury Pluto, which can make it very difficult. And that very thing can in itself end up breeding the very arguments and difficulties that it's very often trying to avoid. Because if you're going out into the world with that paranoid perspective of everyone's out to get me, everyone's trying to fuck me over, everyone's, has these secret plots against me, then you're going to see them and you're going to start acting suspiciously and shiftily in an untrustworthy manner. And so people will have those same negative attentions of you. And the fact is, we all have that part of ourselves, and being honest about those shadows and being honest about those shadows in the people we love is one of the ways of, I feel coming to a proper state of harmony, is just being honest that there is that terrifying devil inside all of us. And that's okay, provided we don't let it take over us. And we see this happening all the time. People project their devils onto their partners and to their loved ones in relationships. And they meet that side of another person and they go, oh, now I know what they're really like, which isn't really fair, because we all have that side of us. We all have that terrifying inner devil and tyrant. And sometimes it's a relief to be able to point the finger and go, aha, it's you who are the devil. Because if you are looking outward at the devil, you don't have to look at the devil within yourself. And that's a much more carefree world to inhabit in. But especially being in Capricorn, there is that obsession with accumulating money, with resources, with business, with finding ways to profit from someone else's pain. So I feel that aspect can actually be a really good opportunity to do some deep psychological work and to look at those deeper, darker corners of our minds, and to approach them not from a place of judgment and fear, but just to see where they are coming from. Because very often the most negative, the most offensive, the most hateful part of our minds is just the part of us that is very wounded, that is very afraid, and which is trying to protect itself. If you think about the stinger of a scorpion, which we associate with Pluto and Scorpio, it is to protect, in essence, what is a very, very weak creature. It's just a small insect. It's very fragile. It's very vulnerable. And the more violently, the more extremely we project hate and try and defend ourselves, we're doing it because that really traumatized and vulnerable part of ourselves is being approached. And having the honesty to know where that is coming from can really help us to let that scorpion not just start stinging everyone around us as a defense mechanism. It can teach us where that's coming from, that it's coming from a place of hurt and fear, and that we don't necessarily have to project it on someone else. And so especially, during that conjunction, it's a good time for really thinking about your deeper thoughts, thinking really deeply about what you actually need to say and communicate to other people, and how you're going to say it so that you can best be understood, so you can get to the roots of a given emotion or a conundrum and say to another person, this is how I'm feeling and this is what I need, without it all just coming out in this hostile, aggressive burst. Okay, so some of the deeper psychological aspects of Mercury retrograde in this current transit. But there's also the fairly routine stuff which happens wherever Mercury retrograde is transiting. I would say, especially if you have your horoscope, look at the house that Mercury retrograde is transiting, as that will give you some clue as to the flavor and some of the issues that you might be facing. If you're interested in that, please feel free to message me and we can talk about it. Very often people from our past, especially people we've had problems with in the past, or ex-partners, can suddenly appear and want to have some kind of engagement with us out of nowhere. There's the usual advice about, well, especially being careful during travel, when you're on the road, with any travel arrangements you make, always prepare for the worst. Be very careful driving, because there are definitely more accidents and car crashes during Mercury retrograde. If Mercury is governing how we're relating to and picking up information from our environment, when he's not working during retrograde, we can miss the obvious. We can have bigger blind spots, and that's when those accidents and oversights occur, especially as it also causes problems with technology. And time again, every Mercury retrograde, phones break or get dropped down the toilet, cars suddenly need repairing. I'm a musician, PAs suddenly bust and need fixing. So really, a lot of the time Mercury retrograde is kind of about saying, there's all these things that have been maybe breaking or not working for a while. Now's the time to have the pit stop and actually look after them. And time again, approaching Mercury retrograde, I have dreams about parking a car. And to me, that's one of the important symbols of Mercury retrograde. It's a time for stopping, for pausing, for regrouping, for reassessing, and for looking within, rather than just carrying on with onward motion. In the work and in other places, there can be unexpected bills, which can be very annoying. So lots of cancellations. Just generally, it's best to be flexible and to go with the flow and to not expect things to go according to plan. Sometimes during work, other people get sick or drop out at the last minute, and we have to cover their shifts, and there's a whole frenzy of work and extra crises that we have to take care of. And it's those niggling annoyances that make people fear Mercury retrograde rather than any of the deeper stuff. Anyway, I think that's enough for now. Video.